Hey, it's Jared with Gear and Light. Welcome to my tutorial on the Canon R6 camera. This camera is fantastic. I absolutely love what Canon is doing with their mirrorless cameras, and so I wanted to walk you through how to use this camera, whether you're new to this particular camera or this is the first time that you've jumped up to a higher-end camera that has more features. This video is going to help you get a good understanding of how to use your R6 so that you can get the best photos out of this camera. Now, I also have a course called Ditch Auto, which is going to help you shoot in manual mode on your camera. Manual mode is going to give you control over things like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO so that you can tell your camera what kind of image you're looking to create rather than letting it do it on its own. So if you're interested, that link is down in the description below. So this camera is reminiscent to me of their DSLR cameras, just in its shape and ergonomics, and I love that about it. It gives you plenty to hold on to. And so we're going to walk around the body of the camera, looking at the different buttons and features. We'll go into the menu a little bit and talk about camera settings. So looking at the top of the camera, we have the power switch over here, very simple, on and off. We could power the camera on. And then we have the mode dial. The mode dial is going to take us between our photo mode and video mode, as well as our shooting modes. And so there's a lot that this dial will do. So let's talk about it. Your camera by default is going to come on the A+ mode, the automatic mode. This is going to tell the camera, make all the settings changes for me. I want to point this camera at something, press the shutter, and camera do all of the work to figure out the exposure and everything. That's fine, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of these other settings as well. Main settings that most people would end up using on a camera like this would be either manual mode, aperture priority mode, which is AV, shutter priority mode, which is TV, or the video camera mode over here. Now, you don't have to switch the mode dial over to video in order to shoot video. You have your record button right here. You could just press it and record. However, switching it into video mode does give you some settings and reports on the back of the screen that are more specific to video, because you're telling your camera, hey, I'm about to shoot video, and it's going to show you things that are specific to video, like your audio levels. It's not going to show you your audio levels when you are in standard manual mode. So with this mode dial, you rotate it to get to the different settings that you want. So we would rotate it to get to video. And so if we look at the back of the screen here, we can see that there's a record button, and there's also other information that's specific to video, and it shows us that we're in video mode as well. And then if we rotate this back around to, say, photo mode for automatic, you can see it represents the mode that we're in here. And then if I move back to manual mode, which is what I shoot in, you can see I get M here, and I get a lot of feedback on the back of the display showing me different options and settings that I have that I could utilize. So this mode dial, I mean, if all you're going to be doing is shooting photos, chances are you probably won't be going out of whatever photo mode you will use. Or if you shoot video primarily, you'll probably stay in the video mode as well. C1, C2, and C3 are custom settings modes. So if you find that you have settings that you want to use for a specific type of shooting, like shooting landscapes, you can save those settings to custom function 1. And then if you have portrait settings that are different, you can set that to C2. And then maybe you have some video specific settings that you want to be able to recall easily, you can set those to C3. And those are like the memory mode on a calculator, if you remember that, being able to save information to memory for later. That's essentially what these options are. So that's going to do it for this mode section. Let's talk about the rest of the buttons on top of the camera. I already talked about the record button, which has the little red circle in the middle. And then we have a lock button, which is awkwardly placed, but it is there. This lock button actually will lock us from making any control changes. See how it says controls locked? Controls unlocked. And what's annoying about this being right next to the record button is that half the time I'm, trying to hit record, I'm not looking with my eyes, I'm just going by feel, and I'll accidentally hit the lock controls button, and then I'm not recording. So for me, I will show you later how we can map this button to something else. So looking around the rest of the camera, we have the shutter on the front. The shutter is very self-explanatory. You press this and the camera goes and tries to focus, and then you press it the rest of the way and you take a picture. We also have this M-FN button here, which if I push it, it takes us into an option where we can change a lot of our manual functions, manual control functions. And so if you see on the back here, we have our ISO control. And then we also have some shooting modes that I can switch between. So if I rotate my dial here, I can switch between these different modes and get to these different modes quickly. These are important modes when you're shooting in manual mode, and so that's why it is the MFN button, manual function button, which makes it easy for getting to those settings. Now, this rolling rocker switch right here will actually adjust your shutter speed. So if you are in a manual mode or you are in shutter priority, which is TV mode, then you can see I can adjust my shutter speed. And as I rotate this, the shutter speed adjusts. Now this other dial here will allow me to adjust my ISO, and this of course is in manual mode as well. If you are in automatic mode, it's not going to have the same functionality. And so as I adjust this one, my ISO increases or decreases. And so on the top of the camera, not a whole lot of buttons or options, but a very simple platform to get used to, which these buttons primarily are going to be your index finger on top of the camera, shooting photos, adjusting your shutter speed, hitting record, locking the controls, changing the dial, and then also adjusting your ISO. So let's move on to the back of the camera. Back of the camera is also pretty simple. Over here we have a rate button, which this rate button isn't set to do anything unless you are watching a photo back. So if we go back and look at a photo, I can hit rate and I can rate it up to 5 stars or rate off. This is great because as you're shooting photos, you can add a rating to the photo as you play it back. And then when you take your SD card out and put it in the computer and load your photos into something like Adobe Lightroom, that rating will already be applied, and it'll make it easier for you to sort through your photos and get to the ones that you already knew were going to be great. So I think that's a cool option. We'll come back to the menu button in a minute here. Moving over to the right side of the camera, we have a button at the top right that allows us to switch between our different autofocus modes. And the back of the screen is a touch screen, so I can tap and move between these. Moving over to the next button, this is your exposure lock. So if you're shooting in one of the automatic modes or manual assist mode like shutter priority or aperture priority, that button is going to lock your exposure. Think of it this way: if you're in an automatic mode or one of the manual assist modes that does make some setting changes for you, and you point your camera and everything looks good, and then you're just waiting to take your shot, you could just move your camera a little bit and it's going to change exposure. So if I take a picture, like looking right here, if I'm in one of those assist modes that does some settings changes for me, and then I just move ever so slightly and take another picture, those pictures could be exposed differently, giving you different exposures and making one image brighter or darker than the other. So while you're shooting, what you would do, once everything looks good on the back of the camera, is just hold down that button. And as you hold down that button, it's not going to change your exposure at all. It's going to lock it. And that way, as you take a few photos in this setting, it's going to lock your exposure. And then when you're done, and you can just let off the button and then go and shoot, and the camera will reapply new settings as it finds them necessary. So kind of a neat button, not super useful if you're shooting in full manual mode. This is one of those buttons that you can map to something else, maybe something that's a little bit more functional if you are shooting in manual mode. Next to that button, we have the AF on. This is the autofocus on button, which essentially does the same thing as partially holding down the shutter. So when I hold down the shutter button, it goes and enables autofocus, and the camera will start to try and achieve autofocus. I can also press the button on the back. Back in the day when I was shooting Canon DSLR, it was not accurate, and I didn't like the autofocus triggering every time I pressed the shutter button. So I disabled that so that the shutter button only took pictures and told me what the exposure of my shot was. And then I would use this AF on button on the back for my autofocus. And so I would press the autofocus button to get autofocus on whatever it was I was trying to take a picture of, and then once I had autofocus achieved, or I had focus achieved, I would let off the button and then take my picture. And that gave me a little bit more control over what the camera was trying to do. I used to shoot a lot of weddings, and so I'd be waiting for the bride and groom to have their first kiss. I'd be all framed up and ready to go, and I'd have autofocus achieved, and then I'd press down the shutter button and the camera would search for focus for a second. And I wouldn't miss the shot, but I would definitely be afraid for a second there that I missed the shot. And so I would use the AF on button to achieve autofocus that's on the back of the camera, and then I would use the shutter button to take the picture, not to achieve any form of autofocus. So you can still disable that in the camera settings, and I'll show you that really quickly when we get to camera settings. But let's keep moving along. We have a D-pad here on the back of the screen, which makes it easy for moving focus points around, depending on what mode that you're in. So if I go into a focus mode, such as this Spot AF focus mode, you can see that I can use the D-pad to move it around, and I can move that focus point around. Essentially, by doing this, I am telling the camera, put the autofocus point right within that box. And I use this feature a lot when shooting, because otherwise the camera is searching everything that it can see. Anything the sensor can see, it is searching to try and achieve autofocus. And sometimes, if there's a lot going on, especially people in the background, these cameras that want to detect faces are going to be looking at all those faces. And so your focus is going to be going all over the place trying to find what you want. And with the Canon, especially these mirrorless cameras from Canon, I found that it does an awful lot of focus searching. So even though these cameras have very fast and accurate autofocus, I still like to switch it to this mode and then actually just move the focus point around myself by using this D-pad. And so you can also tap, of course, on the back of the screen as well. That's another way to achieve autofocus. And then if you are in the face tracking mode, you can also still use this tap tracking, and it will actually track the subject really well. It's pretty neat how it works. So moving on from autofocus and the D-pad, which typically controls the focus points, and of course you can use the D-pad here to get through the settings menu. We have a magnification, and so magnification mode can be used to help you achieve autofocus if you are in a manual focus mode, and then it also works for zooming in on the back of photos when you are in preview mode. We also have an info button that switches between the different bits of info that you see on the screen, so different display options. And then we have the Q Quick Settings button that gives us access to all sorts of different settings. And they're laid out this way so that we can tap on them and get access to all of these different settings and make changes on the fly without having to dig through a menu. So Quick Settings is good to get familiar with because it's quickly going to get you to all of the settings that you most likely will need access to. This dial here on the back, as I mentioned before, is set to adjust your aperture by default. So if you are in a manual mode or you're in aperture priority mode, this will adjust your aperture. Otherwise, it's not really going to do much if you're in automatic mode. And the same thing if you're in video mode, this will be set to adjust your aperture. The set button is just to confirm your settings. Now, down at the bottom, we've got our replay button to play back our images, and then we can rotate the dial to go through all of our images and see everything that we've shot. And then we have the trash can button, which is going to allow us to trash one of those images if we wanted to get rid of it. You can also map the trash can button to do stuff when you are not in playback mode. So just looking at the front of the camera, we've got a couple of buttons here. We've got a button down at the bottom, which this button is going to help us see our depth of field. It's a depth of field preview button. And so if you are wanting to see what your depth of field is going to look like, you essentially just hold this button down and it's going to preview the depth of field that you would see after capturing the image. Sometimes it's kind of hard to see that in live preview mode. So this depth of field preview mode is going to help us see and be able to identify what that image is going to look like without having just taken it. Sometimes I find it easier just to take the image and even just a little bit more accurate. Of course, this button right here is going to allow us to release the lens from the camera. And then as far as lenses go, depending on the lens that you have, there are different settings that you would have on your lens. This is a 35mm prime lens, and so it does not have any zoom. So it has a focus ring, and then it also has a customizable control ring, which all of these RF lenses have, and I have that mapped to adjust my ISO. So you can see here, as I rotate this dial on the front of the screen, I am adjusting my ISO. We also have an autofocus manual focus switch, and this lens has stabilization, so we could turn that on and off right here. Moving over to the right side of the camera, we have 2 SD card slots, and I use Lexar SD cards. I will put a link in the description below to the SD cards that I use. And then over on the left side of the camera, we have access to ports. We have our microphone jack here. We have a headphone jack here for previewing back the audio levels. We have a button. We have a remote where we plug in our remote if you are controlling this camera externally from a handheld remote. And then we also have USB Type-C, which you can use to charge your camera. And then we have an HDMI out, which is micro HDMI out, which you would most likely need some sort of an adapter like this. We have micro HDMI to full HDMI, so that then you can plug your HDMI into something like a computer monitor, a TV, or an external recording device like an Atomos Ninja. And then we have access to the battery, and if you buy an external grip, you can actually remove, by sliding this little switch, remove the battery door and use an external grip to add additional battery storage on your camera. All right, so we're going to go through the menu now. I said we're going to talk about the menu later, so I click on the menu. I'm going to go to the beginning of the menu. You can see here we have our image quality options, which is giving me 2 options and 2 SD card options. That's because I've chosen to split how the camera records to my SD cards. Since I have 2 SD card slots in there, and the camera can take RAW and JPEG images, I have my RAW images going to one card, my JPEG images going to another card, and then when I shoot video, I have video going to both cards simultaneously. So in order to get your menu looking like this, you have to have 2 SD cards in your camera, and then you go over to Settings, Record Function Card, and then you go to Record Separately as the photo option. Notice the little photo icon, and then I set Video to record to multiple, which tells the camera to record that to both cards. And then playback, I don't really care which card it plays back from. I can choose it to play back from card 1 or card 2. And so if I go back to the main menu now, the very first shooting menu, I have the option to choose what I want recording to which card. And so I have raw images recording to my main card, my first card, and then I'll hit set to hit OK. And then in my second card, I have large JPEGs. And the reason that I do that is because RAW files are not perfect. I've had them be corrupt before. This doesn't happen very often, but I have had RAW images become corrupt. And when that happens, I want a backup. I don't want another large RAW image as a backup because this doesn't happen very often. And so usually a JPEG image is going to be fine as a backup. And so even if I had a card failure, I had one card fail on me, like my main card, at least I have that second SD card that not only has large JPEG images, but also has a secondary copy of the videos that I've recorded. So much of the rest of the shooting menu I leave at the default settings. We'll just quickly go through. Here's where I would adjust my white balance. There are lots of white balance presets, or the ability to set the color temperature manually right here. The R6 has a built-in interval timer, and that interval timer allows you to do things like shoot time lapses. And so I can come in here and enable this and then set up those features and then shoot time lapses with that, which is awesome to have that built in. Now on the Shoot 9 menu, I can set my video settings, which of course if I was in video mode, using the mode dial on the front of the camera, this would be a bit earlier in the settings, but I can also set those right here. So I'll go into Movie Record Quality, and I make sure that's set to 4K. What this is going to do is allow for 4K video to be captured when I'm in photo mode and I hit the record button. So I still will need to go and set up video settings, which we'll do after we get through the rest of these settings. I can set sound recording here. It's set to auto by default, or I can set it to manual and then manually set these controls by rotating this dial. And you may need to manually set these settings if you're going to use an external microphone. I recommend using an external microphone like a Rode mic, like a Rode video mic, to get better quality video out of your camera. So manual controls always work best. Under the autofocus menu, AF operation I have set to servo AF. That means that the camera is continuously going to try and focus and move focus on subjects when I have the shutter button pressed down. I can set this back to one shot, which is what it's set by default, and one shot is good for subjects that aren't moving. You press down the shutter, you know they're not going to move between the time that you press the shutter down a little bit for the camera to get focused, and then you press the shutter down all the way to take the picture. So one shot usually is fine for subjects that are not moving. But servo AF is pretty much necessary for anything that's going to move. You can come in here and change your AF tracking mode, which is something that we looked at with this top right button. And then you can set your subject to detect between people, animals, vehicles, or just turn that off altogether so that the camera does not prioritize any type of subject. And then there are a lot of other options here as well. We've got manual focus peak settings that are great for video. We have specific settings for different types of scenarios and setting our camera up how to respond within those. I have these all set by default, but if you want to change the sensitivity by making autofocus more sensitive or making it respond more slowly to different things that are happening, you can come in here and customize those settings as well. We have different settings options here, for additional stuff for autofocus, like one shot AF release prior, and I can set it focus or release. And so when is that AF single shot going to enable? There's a lot of settings in here for autofocus, which really makes this R6 a powerhouse in autofocus, and also limitations that you can set as well. A lot of these settings are more advanced and are settings that I don't even change because the camera does so well on its own. So we're going to move over to Play 1, where we can protect images, erase. So this is the playback menu. And we can come through here, print order, photo book setup. These are things I would never even think of doing inside of a camera, but there are options. Raw image processing, resize cropping. We can do an HEIF to JPEG conversion from within the camera. We can do a slideshow of our images. These would be good. This would be a good setting if you have the HDMI cable connected to something like a television. We have some playback information. Now we're moving into Network 1 menu, which is going to allow us to enable and connect our camera to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth devices. Connecting your camera to Wi-Fi is going to allow it to be seen by other devices that can connect to it, such as your smartphone, for doing things like image transfer. Bluetooth is also an option there, and using the Canon app, you can connect your camera to your phone via Bluetooth, and then your phone can send its GPS data over to the camera so it can tag those images with GPS data, which is pretty cool as well. So you can come in here and connect these things. I will make a separate video on how to connect and set this up, so make sure to subscribe to the channel here so you get access to that video. And then reset communication settings. If you just need to go back to default, there's an option for that. So now we're in the setup menu. We're going to go through this really fast because this video is getting quite long. We already went through the record function setup. We have the format card option here. I highly recommend that you format your SD cards when they are in the camera. Don't use your computer to format the SD cards. We can come in here and set our time, date and time zone and all of that stuff, which is important to have set so that your images are set with the date and time appropriately. And then we can move down through the menu where I can disable things like the beep that the camera makes. I can change the menu size help text to something larger, a little bit easier to read. I could change my headphone volume, change power saving mode and eco mode on the camera for extending the battery life. My screen viewfinder display, I can set a couple of different options here. So only screen, auto switching, viewfinder only, or screen only. By default, Notice how if I put my finger over this sensor here that's on the back of the eyepiece and it turns the screen off. This is switching the screen off and switching it to the internal EVF here, the viewfinder, so that I can see through this and not get this right in my face. And also this is a touchscreen, and so if I was touching it with my face, it would be touching switches. And so you can enable that functionality and set that up how you would like here. We also have our HDMI resolution for output. We can turn our touch control to standard, sensitive, or disable it, which is our touchscreen control. We have sensor cleaning, which is good to do every now and then, just to go and use the sensor cleaning mode to just shake off any dust or debris that might be on your sensor. And then we have options in here like resetting our camera. We've got custom shooting mode, register. So this is these 3 different shooting modes that I talked about earlier. This is where you would register their settings. And so all I'd have to do is just hit this and then hit OK. And it's writing the settings that my camera has right now to that C1. And then of course I can do that for C2 and C3 as well. I can clear all those settings here. And of course, copyright information is something that's important to set. I showed how to do this in my top settings to change on this camera, so make sure to check out that video as well. And then you can see your firmware versions here for both the camera and the lens. Now moving into the custom function setting options, we're not going to go too deep into some of these. The main one that I want to show you is the ability to customize our buttons. And so you can see you get a picture of the camera here and the settings over here. You can customize the settings for both the camera for photo mode and video mode for most of them. If there's 2 little boxes, you can customize them for individual modes. So as I move through here to these different settings and make adjustments, I can make adjustments to these different settings and change their functionality based on what I want to achieve. So for example, earlier I talked about that AE lock, that exposure lock button not being super useful for me in manual mode. I can hit set and I can go and change this to any other setting in the camera and customize that and make that button do something else. There's also on a lot of these Canon cameras, there might be a button on the side of the lens. There's also the control ring, and so I can set this control ring to do something custom, and that is the settings option that I would use here, either custom buttons, custom dials, control ring, and then I can clear settings if things got a little carried away and I messed up some settings and I wanted to go back to default. There's some other options here we're not going to go through. I can clear all custom functions, and then we also have the ability to build out our own custom menu of settings that are within the rest of the camera. So we have quick access menu. So this is like your favorites, your favorite menu items all in one menu, and you can create that and set that up here. So that was long. That was a lot of information. It was really fast. And if you want to learn more about this camera, I highly recommend taking my R6 course. Link is down in the description below. In the course, we're not only going to go into these settings in much more detail, but we're also going to learn how to shoot with this camera. I'm going to talk about those different settings and teach you how to use manual mode and some of the other modes on the camera so that you can capture the best photos and video out of this fantastic camera. So I hope that you check that out. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you can be notified when I put out new videos, and I hope to see you back in another one soon. Take care.